Welcome back, everybody. We're on to Unit 2's Week 2, where we're talking about perimeter security, essentially, and grounds. And last week we spoke about locks and locking devices, and I was really impressed with the pictures that everybody sent in and their explanations. Not everybody got them right, but that's okay. It takes a little bit of time, and actually I'd like you to spend some time looking at locks. I know that sounds really weird, but when you spec a building, at some point in your security career, someone's going to say, we have a new building being built or a new wing going on or a renovation, and you're going to have to specify what type of lock goes on a door. So it's important that you understand what types there are and what their functions are. And even if you go into the integration game where you might be in sales of security equipment or something, you need to be able to match up the door hardware with whatever you sell, because most security hardware will in some way integrate with doors and how they operate. So locks are really important. And this week, though, we're going to talk about barriers and lighting a little bit. I hope you've done the reading. If you've not, please go back first before you view this lecture and do the reading. It's a full chapter this time, but it's a light read. I imagine it's maybe 20 minutes, but do that first, and then let's talk a little bit about barriers and lighting. So while the doors and the locks and other devices secure the skin of a building, and that's what we call the outside walls of a building, the building skin, and that may be your perimeter, but in most cases, you have some grounds. Notwithstanding buildings that may be in a very congested city, you normally have some kind of a buffer zone between your building and where people come up to your building. And outside the skin, we have the grounds, parking areas, common areas, other buffers. So on the campus of Slippery Rock, we have the building skin on spots. And then you have the quad area, as I call it, the open area in the middle, where that's a buffer area and a common area. And those where a real buffer exists, you can really enhance your deter, delay, and detect elements. I know the book uses the word deny, and they use it again in this chapter you're going to read. But they do admit, I thought it was kind of funny in the book where they use the word deny, and then later on they basically tell you that you really can't deny that any barrier can be breached, and that is true. But lights and physical barriers are really economical, and they can be effective in deterring, delaying, and giving you time to detect somebody using that depth and defense we talked about in the last unit. So when you think about barriers, normally when you talk about barriers around a piece of property, you think fences. And fences are a barrier, but I'm going to show you in a second why they may not be your best bet and why they may be a little over used or people over rely on fences. But rocks, boulders, trees, a serpentine roadway that goes and winds in and around, kind of goes in, in the pattern of back and forth and back and forth. That's the type of thing that will slow someone down. Planters, big heavy planters, bollards, and if you don't know what a bollard is, we're going to watch a video on bollards that I think is pretty cool. A moat, we all, remember the old, castles with the moat around them. Buildings are still built with little ponds and things around them, and those are very good devices for slowing somebody down getting to the skin of your building. Nobody really wants to go through the mucky water in a little pond around your facility to get to the building. They're going to go a different way, and that's the way that you build up with your cameras and your other detection devices so that you can follow them as they start to come up to your building. So in this case, CPTED principles, where we have crime prevention through environmental design, really can be effective. We talked about it when we talk about locks and doors and the walls inside of a building. Normally an architect is going to spec that. There are many building codes, a lot of things interior to a building that you can't affect to really put crime prevention in place inside of a building. But when you get out into the grounds and you talk to landscapers and landscape designers, they are very attuned. The good commercial ones are very attuned to security through proper design. And so you have the opportunity to do that. Remember that anything of sufficient size, weight, or composition can be a good barrier. Okay, and the barrier must match the thing you wish to bar. So, I've had dogs my entire adult life. And I've had Siberian Huskies and Great Pyrenees. And a Great Pyrenees this one weighed in at about 210 pounds. It was a small horse. I now have Maltipoos. The largest one weighs about 12 pounds. When I put up a fence at my last house for that Great Pyrenees, it had to be 6-foot chain link because he would jump a 4-foot. He would get up on it and take himself over it when he was a pup. So I had to have a full-size fence. That barrier, in this case, to keep something in rather than out, had to match the thing I was trying to bar. the dog getting out, and in this case, this particular dog taking someone's leg off. With the Maltipoos, I have a little fence that I bought at the Home Depot that I tapped in some metal stakes and put up in around the back where nobody can see it. And when I open the back door, they just kind of go out and run around in it, and they're just fine. I think they're afraid of the fence, quite frankly. They don't even touch it. They don't know what it is, but I'm trying to keep them in. And at their weight, that little tiny fence that Zeke, the dog I had before, would have probably eaten, they just stay away from it, and they don't even try to climb on it because it's a fence and it keeps them in. So remember that analogy of the big dog and the big fence and the little dog and the little fence. When you start to put up barriers, you want to make sure that your barrier matches the thing that you're trying to bar. Putting up planters, heavy-duty planters, for an example, in front of your doors may keep a vehicle from ramming the front doors of your facility. But they wouldn't keep a person out because the person has to be able to walk through, and they can, even if the planters are up, they can generally climb over them. So remember that your barriers must match the thing you wish to bar, and that anything of sufficient size, weight, or composition can be a good barrier if you're remembering that you just need to match the thing you're trying to keep in or out. So examples of barriers that you might use in a commercial or an industrial, an organizational security program for a building. Fences and gating. Now, fences don't have to be chain link fences. They can be ornamental fences. They can be a knee wall with a fence on top of it. But fences, again, I'm going to show you in a second how they're good, but they have their purpose, and it may not be simply keeping people out. Bollards. A bollard, and I'll show you a bollard. A bollard is simply a post, if you will, coming out of the ground to protect something from being rammed into normally by a vehicle. Masonry walls, even if they're a low wall, a knee wall as it's called, if the wall is only 2 or 3 feet high, but you run into it with a vehicle, if that is what you're trying to bar, it's going to stop the average car. You know, a big truck may hit it. Certainly the vehicle will fly over it. There's going to be carnage. But if you have it far enough back and a vehicle runs into it and the vehicle flips over it, the carnage happens inside the vehicle, and quite frankly, that's natural selection, right? The person who rammed the wall is the one who gets hurt in the accident, and okay, I can live with that. But don't think that a wall has to be really big. It depends on what you're trying to keep in or out. Ornamental boulders and flower planters, those types of things make excellent barriers, especially for vehicles, or to direct people in a certain direction. If you have a whole row of flower planters, someone could jump over them, certainly, but most of the time someone will come down along that row and it will direct them into a certain entrance, and that's the one where you have most of your camera coverage and your lit entryway, and you're trying to direct people to a certain way. So not necessarily bar them, but direct them through the use of boulders, flower planters, those sorts of things. And then we'll talk about holly hedges, any type of hedge, vegetation. The book will tell you that you don't want vegetation around your facility. They actually have a picture of a facility with a big open walkway up to the building so that there's no place for someone to hide. That's great. But I will tell you that most commercial buildings want some sort of greenery around them. The architect will design it in, and you will lose the battle of there'll be no greenery. So when I recommend holly, there's a reason for that, and I'd like to show you that. Barriers are to deter. Anything that delays an adversary is a barrier. Anything that delays the adversary is a barrier. It could be a person standing somewhere, could technically be a barrier. But anything that slows a person down from getting from point A to point B is a barrier by our definition. So, you know, it sounds like I really badmouth fences, and fences are good. But they're used to delay, but not for as long as one might think. So the U.S. Army manual tells us that a 6-foot chain link fence with a 3-strand barbed wire top guard, so 6-foot chain link fence, right? 45-degree outrigg on it, right? So no one can, it's facing back at you if you're the climber. And it has 3 strands of barbed wire, usually 12-gauge steel, 4 barb on every foot on the wire, right? Ugly looking. Has a delay factor of 12 seconds. The dedicated adversary that wants to get over that fence can get over it in 12 seconds, according to the U.S. Army. Now, the Army uses a lot of fencing, and they use a lot of fences with top rigs on them. They've done this research, and I trust it to be accurate. So the real reason for a fence, if you keep it in your mind, is to delineate a property line. If you put up a fence and someone climbs that fence, you know that they intended to do that. They can't say, oh, I just wandered onto your property. I apologize. I didn't know that I was on private property when I climbed the fence. Is not a good excuse. I would not buy that one. If you don't have a fence and they wander onto your property, that could certainly happen. Happens all the time. But if there's a fence, it tells you there's a property delineation there. It says if you climb this fence, when you look at any fence, if you climb this, you will be on property that does not belong to you, belongs to someone else, and they have erected this fence simply to keep you out. So that is the real purpose of a fence for a barrier. It is a property delineation line. It doesn't have a long delay factor. It has some, but not long. And fences can be ugly. But let's take a look at a fence that's pretty famous and how well it deters people. So as we see, fences may or may not be a great barrier, especially if what we're trying to bar are people climbing the fence. Just the sheer number of White House fence jumpers that occur every year kind of blows my mind. Of course, they either are wrapped in flags, they're mentally ill. My favorite one is the one who jumped over wearing a Pikachu outfit just to see if he could do it. I don't think these are as serious a threat as one might think, but they happen frequently, and that's why fences have their use, but it is not an end-all. And the reason I keep bringing it up is that you will find that people who spend money on security will always tell you when you ask for additional funding, but we have a fence. What good is our fence if people can get in? And the whole idea is that you need to explain to them what the limitations of the fence is. Now, in this case, we have planters as barriers, and as you can see, those are pretty heavy-duty planters. Each one of those probably holds pretty close to 1,000 pounds of soil. The plantings on the top, in this case, are immaterial. Could be just about anything. And these are precast polished concrete. I don't know what these, my cursor will show, in between here might be. Could be lighting, actually, on posts. But they, in turn, add just a little bit more of, how you can't really just get something through there. But if you hit one of these with a standard vehicle, it will make for a very, very bad day. And you will see planters used quite a bit as barriers around public buildings. If you go anywhere around a building like a courthouse, you'll normally see them. Large, the Federal Reserve uses them quite a bit. But any public building normally uses planters. They want it to look nice, and you'll get very little pushback when you try to put them in because everybody likes things to look nice. But don't let these green plants just be put in the ground. Put them in a heavy-duty planter and use those planters to control vehicle traffic and to act as a barrier. I also mentioned holly and other shrubs, and I particularly like holly for a couple of reasons. First off, it's very lush. It's very nice color, dark green. It is an evergreen, so it is particularly nice in the wintertime. It's a great contrast with the snow. Here you have a wall that is covered with holly. The wall was textured, so the holly, of course, sticks out a little bit, and it's really kind of cool looking. And so you have the wall itself as a barrier, certainly, but that could be scaled. It is essentially a fence in just a solid form. But it is covered with holly, and the reason I like it covered with holly is not just how it looks. The reason I like holly as a wall covering or as a shrub to use if someone tells you must have greenery around something on your facility where you're concerned about cover and concealment is that no one normally walks through the holly. This is a holly leaf, an American holly leaf. And if you look at those leaves, they are quite rigid. They will bend in the middle, but those edges are quite pointed, and they're quite sharp. And in and of themselves, just one or two, if you touch them, it's uncomfortable. When you fall into that wall that we saw that's absolutely covered with holly, it is more than uncomfortable, it is unbearable. And so if someone tells you you must use hedges, try to get them to use something like holly. There are other burberries and others that are just as bad, but pretty, right? People use them for hedges all the time. I particularly like holly, and you'll hear me say that a couple of times in this and other lectures because it is a really great security tool that people just don't think about using. But that's the reason that I like it, and it makes for a very nice barrier to first delay, certainly deter when you first touch it. It's going to delay you if you try it, and I think it will help with detection because normally you will find the person on the ground giving up, covered with little cuts. And finally, a bollard. And a bollard is not a term that you normally use. Everybody knows what a bollard is when you see one, but it's not a term that everybody knows. So these are bollards. They're put here around a gas standpipe so that no one hits it and releases, gas vapors or natural gas. I don't know if it's liquefied or not, though, in this case, but they're put around there as a safety precaution so that no one will back a vehicle in and break off that standpipe and have a gas leak. Bollards can look like this. They can look like, they may look like that. You'll see precast bollards all over the place. They're quite nice. Sometimes they have lights installed in the top. This one has a really small one here on the side. I don't know whether it's simply for contrast from from the standpoint of someone wanting to make the building look nice, or whether these are detachable and you can move them. So if you had to bring a vehicle in for service, you wouldn't have to move these and detach these. These are anchored down. They normally have a steel pole inside, and they are anchored down. And that may be the reason for a small one, or this could actually just be the top of another one. I can't really tell, but bollards are used all over the place. They tend to have a little pretty look. A lot of times they have lights on the top, but know that it's just not the concrete pillar. There is a pole that is sunk down into the ground, usually at least the length of the bollard itself. So if, in this case, it's a 3-foot bollard. There would be another 3 feet. There'd be a 6-foot pipe in the middle of this that is sunk down in the ground to give it rigidity if someone were to hit it with a vehicle. Again, hit this with a vehicle. Even if you're going at high speed trying to get somewhere, you're going to have a very, very bad day. Now, a type of bollard that's almost exclusively used for security purposes is a pop-up bollard. And you'll actually see them at very high-end apartment complexes or residential areas. So when a vehicle pulls up that belongs to a resident, it has a sensor in it, and the bollard will retract into the ground so they can drive through, and then it will pop back up again. In high security areas, they're used to prevent a vehicle breach of a perimeter. And I've got a video. It lasts about 5 minutes or so, but I think you'll enjoy it, and it'll show you what a bollard can really do. So I think that's a pretty cool video. It's actually, it appears pretty old, but it's dated 2014. And I've seen it a number of times. I've actually seen that same video at trade shows before for the people who sell that particular brand of bollard. And there are others out there. There are high-speed ones that pop up out of the ground much faster. They're actually not as rigid because there's a lot of weight in that. You have to figure that that bollard is not simply made out of just plain old steel. There's a lot of weight in it, so it takes a little while for it to lift up out of the ground. But I have seen that some that have popped up that will actually lift the vehicle right off the ground. There are others that are plates that come up out of the ground just on one side. They're on a hinge, and so they pop up. There are drop arms that will drop down into a receiver on the other side so that you have like just a bar across the roadway. And any of those devices, quite frankly, if they're made right, will disintegrate that truck. And that, in this case, the payload in the back was sand, but normally the payload would be explosives. And as long as you have it far enough away from your building, because as you saw that sand fly, in the case of explosives, they're going to fly, potentially detonate, and the only thing you want them to take out is the driver. If indeed, after hitting that bollard, there's anything left but red mist, you want to make sure that you take him out. So those types of bollards, those types of devices, I'll see if I can find a couple more. I'll post of different other types of devices that pop up out of the ground like that, because I think they have a excuse me, very good use, especially for you Homeland Security folks, where you do have facilities in a commercial corporate facility. You normally don't have to protect like that because you're, although the things you have inside may be more valuable than in a government building, you don't have the threats that a government building normally has. However, if you're a company that makes something that's controversial, an abortion drug perhaps, then you may need something like that because someone may try to ram your building and you might need something like that. So, jumping into lighting. So lighting has a lot of functions, deterrence being a main one. Most crimes will not happen in broad daylight, and the term is broad daylight because of just that. It is so easy to see someone. So if you have something well lit, that indeed in and of itself is a deterrence. There's certainly less chance of accidents. So lighting provides an excellent safety tool. Even in your home, you turn on the light so you can see. Not so much that you're afraid you're going to meet an intruder in your kitchen, but you are a little afraid probably that you're going to stub your toe on something or trip over something and you can't see, so you turn the light on when you go in the kitchen, right? So there's a safety feature to lighting. Identification. When you're driving down the street and you don't know exactly where you're going, say you're driving on a country road, you don't know exactly where you're going, but you know there's a business up ahead, then you see the lights, you know exactly where you're going. It identifies businesses or commercial facilities and gives you an idea of where they are. It doesn't mean that they have to even have a sign. If you know that you're in the general area of something and you see bright lights, you pretty much know you're there. And of course, for our needs, lighting is required to support video. There are very, very low light cameras in use today, but you need some sort of light unless you're using infrared technology, which we'll talk about a little bit in a few weeks. But unless you're using that, you need some form of light to support the video. So lighting is important for that. The great thing about lighting is when you're trying to sell your security program, we've talked about that, trying to get budget from somebody who has the money to help you pay for all the great things you need to do to secure a facility. Lighting's a pretty easy sell. They understand it. They understand the safety factor. You can usually get your safety manager to go hand in hand with you. Everybody kind of understands the fact that lighting is a security tool in that regard. And even if they're not thinking of it in pure terms of security, they're thinking about it in pure terms of lighting is good. We want people to see where they're going, so therefore you'll get funding for your lighting. The book talked about lighting system types and also about lighting types. And the lighting types that they had there listed were good, and some of them I'll repeat here. But there are others that I think you ought to know about, and some of them really are so new that they're not in the book. Fluorescent lighting, we all know fluorescent lighting makes that wonderful loud hum when you turn it on. It's got this look that makes everybody look slightly dead. It's bright. It's very slow to start. If you turn on a fluorescent light, it takes a few seconds for it to fire up. And if you have a lot of lights and you want to fire them up in a hurry, if you have an intrusion on your grounds and you're using it as secondary lighting, if you try to turn on the fluorescent lights and make them bright, it takes a while to get them there. You want that light to be instantaneous. So it's not good for a quick start. And fluorescent lights don't work at all, really, in very cold exterior applications. They're just not meant for cold weather. You will see low-pressure sodium lights, and I bet if you drive anywhere around western Pennsylvania, you will be able to see these, and it will become second nature to you. They are usually on the side of a building. They're usually up about 10 or 12 feet, and they cast a very nice yellow kind of light. They are really old-style exterior lights that you see on warehouse buildings. You'll see them at the self-storage places. You may even see them on the side of buildings at the mall. They're really inexpensive to operate. They're really good in the fog because they cut through fog very well, just like yellow fog lights. These have got a yellow tinge to them, and they cut through the fog. But you will not be able to tell reds and greens on your cameras if someone goes in the vicinity of a low-pressure sodium light. They distort the colors, definitely reds and greens and other colors that may have red and green similarities. And so you might as well not put a color camera up for nighttime use if you have low sodium lighting, because it's not going to tell you anything. A black and white, which usually has a little bit better definition than a color camera, frankly, would do just as well, because you're not going to do much with that yellow light, and it doesn't throw very far. There are mercury vapor. It was very common security lighting in its day, still used. I mean, they're still up all over the place. A very nice blue-white light. If you have mercury vapor lights, you're usually in pretty good shape. They do use a little more energy than others. Much like quartz, very bright quartz-based lights are very, very bright. Great for prisons and those types of things, but they use a lot of energy. The wattage on those things can go into the many thousands of watts to throw light that you need. But today, LED lighting seems to be the thing that everyone is going to. It uses very, very little energy. The bulbs will last for 10, 20, 30 years, depending on the quality of the lighting. And when you're talking about exterior lighting, it's usually very high quality. New cameras now are set to work with the LED color spectrum. And so it's a really great thing for camera use, very low energy, very long life. LED lights, many companies are going in projects now to change their exterior lighting to LED lights for energy use. And as a security manager, you should encourage that, because nothing is worse than trying to get something out of one of your cameras and find out one of your lights has blown out and you don't have enough to support your camera. With the LED, it's very unlikely it's going to blow out. Metal halide is a type of light that was not mentioned in the book, and you will find these when you go into like a warehouse. Even warehouse stores still have them, although I believe they've changed the technology and they still have the same housings. If you look up, there's like a bell-shaped housing, and it's shining down a nice, bright, strong white light that you can see forever. Metal halide lighting was sold for security lighting to security managers around the U.S. and other countries for about 10, 12 years, and everybody pushed metal halide because it used less energy than quartz. It was very bright. They were cheap retrofit, same wattage, and you could take out things like your low sodium. You could take out interior lights and put these up, and everybody loved them because they were so bright, low energy use. Problem with metal halide is that the element inside, if you think about a standard light bulb with that metal element in it, if you look at the old light bulb with the wire inside, metal halide creates a great deal of heat, and so it warps that, and then it weakens the glass around it. And metal halide has a tendency then, after many years of use, several years of use rather, to explode. When it does, the particles that it rains down can be as high as 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. A lot of high bays, like warehouses, would have these lights. They would explode. In warehouses, what do you have? You have wood pallets stacked somewhere, sometimes on the floor. What happens when pieces of hot matter, 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, hits wood? It catches fire. And metal halide lights have been blamed for many fires. So when you get to your first facility, if you find out you have metal halide lights, you should be talking to someone about their plan over time to change them out because of that safety factor, or to put in some type of safety grid or safety glass to catch any particles that may fall if and when they explode. I just put that out there because it's something that's, I won't say it's common, but it certainly is something that is of concern. And I'm not aware of any legislation or any building codes that prohibit grandfathered metal halide lights. Nobody buys them anymore, really, other than to replace things that they've already got in place. But just be aware that metal halide is something, if a security vendor tries to sell you, you probably should just go with the LED. At this point, LED is the lighting that you really want. But there are other things you should consider when you're talking about lighting, and that is, what about ambient lighting? So, when you design a lighting scheme, you have to have lighting on the front of your building, right? But what about if your building is all glass and it's a 24/7 operation and the lights are going to be shining out through the glass? You have ambient lighting. The book talks about foot candles, and the definition of a foot candle is a technical one. It has nothing to do with feet distance and or candle power, as I'm aware of, but it talks about the number of foot candles, and they will tell you that these lights will throw X number of foot candles to take you to a certain level that sounds acceptable. But then you find out that your neighbor has their lights on all night long, and they have even stronger lights, and now you are twice as bright as you need to be. From an energy use perspective, from an economic perspective, from even a look of the building perspective, consider the ambient lighting that's coming from your building or from neighbors. Okay? Does it provide good distribution? And that really is from making sure your lights are up high enough, but not too high. It's the distance from the light to the ground. If you take a flashlight and put it in one hand and you shine it at your other hand from a distance of about 2 feet, you will see your hand and your fingers in the dark. Get closer and closer and closer, and it gets brighter and brighter, and you can see your hands and your fingers until you get to a point where you're a couple of inches away from the front of that flashlight, and then you just have the center of your palm you can see, and the ends of your fingers are pretty hard to see, right? There's not the light distribution. The light power has not changed. The flashlight is the flashlight. But as you got closer to it, you lost some of the peripheral light distribution. So think about how high up your light poles are when you talk about lighting, because if you're going to put lighting way on top of a 3-story building, it's going to lose some of that distribution as it spreads out when it gets to the ground, essentially. But if you have it 10 feet from the building, you're going to replace those low sodium with something much brighter. You may be too low. You might have to get to the top of the building and shine down with those new lights, because if you're too low, you get that flashlight in hand scenario where you're just shining at the palm and you're just too close. So think about the height of lighting. It's very important for the good light distribution. Make sure that when someone does a lighting plan for your facility, they consider the roadways and pathways that lead up to it. If you have a long drive coming up to your facility, you just don't want to light the facility and the parking areas. You want to light that roadway so that you can see who's coming at night with a camera system or even with the naked eye, that someone is coming up that roadway. You want to be able to have good definition all the way out to your perimeter if you can get it that way. And then finally, what does the lighting level say about your company and its commitment to energy use? I had a facility in Ohio that we did a security assessment on, went during the day and assessed their security, and we usually go back at night with a light meter to test as to whether they have sufficient lighting to the perimeter and whether they light. This particular facility didn't have clear zones around their fence, and a clear zone simply means you're cutting back the vegetation, so you're not making it so someone can just climb up the vegetation and get over top of your fence, or you can't see who's there. And so we went back at night to see if the lighting was enough to help deter that, because the trees that were on the other side of the fence didn't belong to us. It belonged to the neighbor. They didn't want to cut the trees. So we figured if the lights were bright enough along the fence line, it wouldn't matter much. You could still see somebody, certainly on the camera system or even with the naked eye, trying to climb the fence. When we got within about a mile of the facility, we could see it because it looked like a high-security prison light up. I had never seen lights so bright on a facility before, and it was standalone in a neighborhood. There wasn't anybody really around it, but from the freeway, you could see this bright halo from a mile or more away. It was just so bright. It would look like a sports stadium lit up at night for a game. And the neighbors complained that those were close enough, and you need to be that close, right? So it wasn't really in a neighborhood, but there was a neighborhood not too far away, and they said that the lights were too bright. It also made it look like we weren't concerned at all with energy use. The lighting just didn't match the need. So just like barriers matching what you're trying to bar, lighting should really match your need. Don't go too far above and beyond with lighting unless you have a prison or a nuclear weapons facility that you're trying to make sure that you can see everything all the time just as if it's daylight. Don't get a bad rep that increases your threat because people start to think bad about you because you look like a high energy user, and that indeed becomes a problem for you and just draws attention. So make sure your lighting doesn't draw too much attention to you either. And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about emergency call stations. And they aren't so much they are a security device in that they are a duress device. Someone can tell you when they're in trouble. I would say they are a crossover between a safety and a security device, but normally they are put in by the security department or a police department if you're on a campus. And you've all seen them. I've got a picture on the next slide just in case you haven't, but it's simply a pole. Usually has an intercom, so you can push a button and immediately be connected to the police department or security department. It has an emergency light on it that when you push the button, it starts to flash so that a responder can immediately see where they're going. They don't have to worry about which, as soon as they pull up in the parking lot area, they know exactly which area to go to. There's normally a camera on it so that someone can see you and make sure that you are okay. There's a light source, right? A lot of times they are installed directly under or even in conjunction with to share power with a street light. And then there's signage to identify the purpose. It would be no good for you to put one of these things up if it didn't say emergency on it and didn't have some basic instruction in bold letters to make sure people understood what they're supposed to use it for, so they don't push the button to ask for directions, that they push the button when they truly have an emergency situation. So here's one. I have to say that I don't recall. Many of you know I've only been on the Slippery Rock campus a handful of times, and I can't say that I recall. I normally park up by the field house. There's a staff parking area up there with a single lane, so it wouldn't be the type of place where you'd put an emergency call box necessarily. They normally go in more remote walking areas or larger parking areas. But this is what one looks like, and it's got the light on top. It says emergency on it. Right here is a button you push, and immediately somebody comes on and says, "May we help you? Do you have an emergency?" And it most likely, I can't tell on this one, has a board level camera right here, which is a small camera with a fisheye lens that will tell the person immediately. Will pop up when this button is pushed so that they can see you while they talk to you on the intercom. This one is at Wichita State University, and I know that they do have cameras built into their emergency call boxes, and they also have integrated their other cameras. So real quick on these, I don't want to spend a lot of time on them, but it's just kind of an interesting thing and something you might be asked about in physical security, so I wanted to cover it. The placement is really key. When you place these in a parking lot, you want to make sure that they are equal distance apart, okay? I know it's very hard sometimes because you have to run cabling for power if you don't strap them essentially to your light poles. You can power them with the power from the light bulbs. There's a transformer that can step the power down so that your emergency call station, which runs on less voltage than your lights, they can run on them, so that's always an option. But they should be equal distance apart. And beware of using them in executive areas only. So I was at a facility one time and there were emergency call stations, and there was executive parking in the front corner of the parking lot closest to the building, and there was general employee parking back for about 500 to maybe 600 cars. Very large lot. And there were emergency call stations in the executive corner, and there were none for others. I will tell you that the farther you get from the building at night, the more chance you have of having an incident. Executives are not the only ones. The logic, according to the security manager, was that they were concerned about executives being kidnapped, and therefore they put them in for that purpose. I would venture to say, should someone be injured farther back in that lot, and you tried to use that in a court of law as your reasoning, that although it may be honest, it probably is not something that's going to be well received. So you want to make sure they're equal distance apart. You want to make sure they all look the same. So, when you go into like a parking structure, a parking deck, those light poles with the light on top aren't really the type you use there. They're normally a smaller box with a light on it, and you bolt it to a wall, sometimes in the stairwells of the parking structure, sometimes onto poles and pillars in the parking structure itself. You want to make sure they're all the same color, they've all got the same type of instructions, all the same type of signage, so it's consistent throughout your entire grounds, so that the pole ones look very similar in color and markings as ones that may be a little bit different application inside of a parking structure, so that there's no relearn of what that is, right? Everybody associates that color. The people at Code Blue, who make a lot of these, always use blue, right? That same color blue. And others have adopted that as well. And when you see that Code Blue box with that blue light on top, you know what it's for. So you want to make sure they look the same, even if they're a little bit different devices for different applications. Go with the same color, same instructions, same emergency lettering on the side. You want to place these, especially in a parking area. If you have picture a big square parking area, and let's say you want these 100 feet apart, and the parking lot is 100 by 100 by 100, all right? most people would think, okay, well, let's put one in each corner and one in the center, and now we're equal distance apart. And that is true. But the ones in the corner require people to run away from the building they came out of to get to an emergency call station. You always want to come in from the corners of a lot an equal distance to put these on. You never want them in the far corner of the lot. If someone gets into trouble, you don't want them running away from the building, running away from where there might be help in a safe area to get to a call box. You want them running back. It's like you get on an airplane and they say, know where the emergency exits are, knowing that the exit may be behind you. Everybody wants to go to the closest exit. You want them to go back toward the closest safe area. So try not to ever think about putting them in the far corners of a lot, even though that may be somewhat intuitive to people. And also know that, and we'll get into integration and camera integration, but you can integrate these signals. So when someone pushes the button, not only does it turn on that little camera that's on the call station, it also swings the cameras on your building around if they're pan, tilt, zoom cameras, right? The kind that move. Or if it's stationary and they're pointed in that direction, if you have a camera on a building pointed, you can turn on automatically and call up those cameras to a monitor so that you can see everything that's going on around that person. You can see not only their face as they're talking to you because you've got that small camera, but now from a building you can potentially see that entire parking lot, see who else may be there, why they may be in trouble, what other adversary you may be running into. You may not want to send your security person alone to find out what's wrong. You might want to summon the police right away when that happens and send the security person to deter and watch what's going on there, right, and have the police respond, depending on what the nature of the emergency is. You may see that the person hits the button and they say, we've got somebody who fell in the parking lot, and you'll be able to see that they ran back 100 feet and there is someone laying in the parking lot, and you can zoom in, you can see that person's unconscious. You'll want that information for the police. So integrate your cameras so that when that button is pushed, the only camera that comes on shouldn't be that one on that emergency station. If there are other cameras in the area on buildings and such, you can make those so that they integrate. It's a hardwired integration in some cases. You have to run a couple of wires. But if you're allowed to put in call stations or asked to put in call stations by your employer, add in the cost of integrating other cameras so that you can get a full view when that button is pushed. That's all I really want to talk about on those. Again, they're more of a safety device than a security device, quite frankly. But they can be a very good tool, a very important tool, if done right. If not, they can be a liability nightmare. So you really want to make sure that you are very judicious in how you place them. Make sure people don't have to run away from the building to get to them if possible. And then make sure that you integrate as many cameras as you can when you get them. So we are at the 42-minute mark, 42 minutes and 49 seconds. And I told you I'd try to keep these under 45. And this week I kept my word. This week you have some deliverables. You should have already read the text, pages 79 to 95, which I believe is chapter 6, if I'm not mistaken, on barriers and lighting. You view the lecture, which you are just finishing now, so you're good to go there. Printed out the slides, as you have in previous weeks, and you've taken your notes on there, and you're going to go take the quiz. Quiz is not that hard. It is 10 questions. It is from a test bank, so it is not the same 10 questions for any one student. It is not in the same order, and the answer is not in the same order. And please don't try to do screenshots because I can see when you do that. But take the quiz, and then you are done for this week. One of the things I'd like you to do this week, and certainly not for a grade, but since we've talked about it, I want you to look around campus, and not just campus, but other places as you're driving, as you're at work, at your other jobs, whatever. Think about the placement of barriers, the lighting choices, and call box locations, and think about, did they get it right? So a lot of you I noticed work at the outlet malls. I'm sure there are bollards at the outlet malls made so that people can't drive a vehicle in the walkways. Any outlet mall I've been to has some sort of bollards and or planters so that vehicles have to all go in a certain way for service. Did they get it right? Could you still get in there with a vehicle? Are the lighting choices proper, and is it even? Is it bright enough? Is it too bright? Call boxes, if you have them, do they appear to be in equal distance? Do they appear to be put in with a thought process for mapping it out so no person is any less or more protected than anyone else? Did they do it right? So with that, I only have one more thing I need you to do, probably the most important thing of the week, and that's to have a great week. and we will touch base, and we will begin with Unit 3 when we get back. And I look forward to it. So talk soon. If you need anything, please contact me. Several of you have, and that's great. It's not a problem. I try to get back with you quickly. Have a great week.